The Second, Third, and Fourth Amendments to the U.S. Constitution each reflect concerns that came out of the Americans' experience before the Revolution. Today we'll understand the history and how those experiences resulted in three of the rights guaranteed to us in our Bill of Rights. My name is Dr. Rick Gardiner from Columbus State University, and this is a Muscogee County School District podcast, the U.S. Constitution. In order to understand the Second Amendment, we need to reflect back upon the beginning of the American Revolution. Do you remember why the first battle of the Revolution took place in Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts? Why was the British Army marching out to Concord? The answer? They had been ordered to go to Concord to take the Americans' weapons away from them. They were trying to seize the colonists' guns. The colonists could not be trusted to own guns. You see, the Declaration of Independence defended the American Revolution by saying this: if a government ever becomes tyrannical, it is the right, it is even the duty of the people to alter or abolish that government. In other words, to overthrow it. But if the government were to take steps to disarm the people, that is, to take away their guns, the government would put itself in a posture where it might be immune to being altered or abolished. So the writers of the Second Amendment believed that the security of the people against evildoers, whether foreign invaders or domestic criminals or even tyrants in government, requires the right of the people to organize themselves into militias to protect themselves. And that, of course, requires them to possess weapons. Now, since 1791, a lot has changed in terms of technology, particularly the technology of weapons. When Einstein discovered that matter can be converted into energy, and when Oppenheimer figured out a way to actually do it, the first nuclear weapons were born. This changed the game entirely. The government of the United States possesses arms today that were unimaginable back in 1791. Today, a violent overthrow of the government by the people is not as simple as everyone getting a musket and gathering out on Lexington Green. As a result, there are many people today who believe that the Second Amendment is kind of silly. It's outdated. It should be repealed. That means essentially being erased. They argue that guns in the hands of civilians cause more societal problems than they prevent. Now, on the other hand, there are a whole lot of gun owners out there who are very opinionated about the Second Amendment. So any movement towards repealing the Second Amendment is going to bring out the anger of a lot of Americans. But there is a great misunderstanding about the Second Amendment and gun ownership. Many of those who are great defenders of the Second Amendment are hunters and members of the National Rifle Association. But the Second Amendment has nothing at all to do with owning a gun for the purpose of hunting. The right to owning a gun is for the purpose of securing a free society by means of militias. Whether guns are an aid or a threat to our safety today, in 1791, the writers of the Bill of Rights believed that the federal government should not prohibit the people from possessing weapons. Now let's turn to the Third Amendment. Do you happen to remember that in the years leading up to the American Revolution, The King of England sent soldiers to the American colonies to make sure that the Americans behaved. They were sent because the king thought the Americans were becoming too rowdy. They needed to be carefully watched. The king and parliament passed laws that were called the Quartering Acts, which basically made sure that the king's soldiers were provided for while they were keeping an eye on the rowdy Americans. Now keep in mind, this was before the war started. It was during peacetime. And Americans felt that there was no need for there even to be an army during peacetime. You see, an army like that's called a standing army, and Americans didn't like standing armies. Well, needless to say, the Americans hated the Quartering Acts. So much so that when it came time for them to write a Bill of Rights, it was one of the first items they agreed to prohibit in the new nation. Americans are protected from any requirement to quarter military troops during peacetime. That's what our Third Amendment says. Now, it's not one of the better known rights that we have as Americans, and that kind of makes sense. It's not too often that a Marine or an Army platoon shows up at your door and demands to use your guest room. But if they ever do, you can plead the Third Amendment and close the door right there. Now let's turn to the Fourth Amendment. This is one that most of us cherish dearly. Prior to the Revolution, it was the practice of some British government officials to seek out evidence that Americans were doing something that they shouldn't be doing. They would demand to search a house or to read through someone's letters or papers just to see if they might be able to find something that would prove the Americans were doing something wrong. Well, the Fourth Amendment in the Bill of Rights simply states that the government, such as police officers, cannot do that. The Fourth Amendment is sometimes referred to as our privacy rights. No one representing the government has the right to search your property or your private papers, especially if they're looking to find something incriminating. The amendment does include an exception that allows the government to search your stuff under certain conditions. This exception is known as a warrant. A warrant is a document issued and signed by a judge that states that there's already enough evidence to suspect that you've done something wrong. And so the search is just necessary or warranted in order to confirm what the government already knows. But without a warrant, a search is not constitutionally permitted. And if an officer of the law were to come to your house just to look around in your sock drawers, if that officer does not have a warrant signed by a judge, then it's fully appropriate to exercise your constitutional rights and deny that officer access to your property. Over the years, the Fourth Amendment has been reinterpreted. Here are 3 tough questions, for example. What about your car? If you're driving down the road and you get pulled over, does an officer have the right to search your car without a warrant? Well, cars used to be protected by the Fourth Amendment, but that was changed by the Supreme Court, who stated that when your car is on the highway, it's not on private property. So your Fourth Amendment rights do not apply there. What about your high school locker? Again, there was a time when that was deemed a private domain. But that too has been changed for similar reasons. Your principal operates in loco parentis. That's a Latin phrase meaning in the place of your parent. And just as your parent has the right to search your bedroom closet, your principal also has the right to search your locker without a warrant. How about cell phone communications? This created quite a stir in the last few years when President Bush's people began collecting private cell phone records. From the president's point of view, this was a necessary act of war to fight terrorism and to prevent further attacks. Many of the people whose phone communications were of interest to the government were foreigners who don't have U.S. constitutional rights anyway. But what about those of us who are innocent Americans? Should the government be able to have access to our phone communications without a warrant? Well, the case never went to the Supreme Court, but after a lot of complaining about Fourth Amendment rights being violated, the government apparently stopped collecting cell phone records. In the next podcast, we'll look at our due process rights, the rights that the founders wanted to provide to people who were accused of wrongdoing. My name is Dr. Rick Gardiner from Columbus State University, and this has been a Muscogee County School District podcast, the U.S. Constitution.